Thank you. It's a compliment for you to see you and to share this evening with you. I have come recently, and I should for a long time earlier have seen that your vices are the dark side of your virtues, and one of my virtues as being a teacher at Spring Hill College is talking. So you can imagine the dark side there. The vice is talking. Maybe too much. And I often say, you know, after you all have gone home, I'll still be here talking in the empty room. But I think my perception of situations like this, and just for starters, logistics, everybody can hear me okay? Those of you that are on the periphery there can hear okay? Because I'm, pardon? You can. Cannot flow, right. No, well, the trouble is that traps me over there. And I'm just not going to do that. They have me wired, they have me set to speak through the video, so I'm really having to work with two sound systems. So can you hear me okay now, Flo? Yeah. Okay, I'll try to not blow everybody else out of the front rows, which is a constitutional problem also. But you hear me, okay, but you all are okay on this? All right, and I'm not being rude to other people in terms of making your hair fly backwards like that old, loudspeaker commercial of the person sitting in the chair with his hair flowing because of the volume. At any rate, my perception in situations like this is that if I speak perhaps for 20 minutes, and maybe not even that, and then respond to your questions, I speak to you. I don't speak to outer space, which I tend to, I teach a course in major world religions at Spring Hill College, so I'm doing things on Hinduism and Buddhism and stuff like that, so I tend to speak to outer space or inner space or what have you, and my thought is to speak to you and to speak to your questions that may be suggested by the dates that are on the page there or near this. And if anyone happened to miss those dates, there are pages at the door if you would like some. Okay, just if you would like to have that, okay? Okay, for starters, I have the older Constitution with me. I have the younger more recent Constitution. I have a copy of what is referred to as the Blue Book, which some may know. I inquired around how much this book costs. I think it's like $7.50 or so. Freddie or Teresa, do you happen to know what the book is? Did anyone buy one recently? If you take the class, which you might be, please feel strongly encouraged to participate in the class, whether you're interested in membership in the corporation or not. I think it's like $25 to take the class, and that pays for several books, an abbreviated version of Henry George's Progress and Poverty, which was part of the launching of nationally of what had already been an international movement in the 1880s that was called the single tax principle. Okay? At any rate, the book is the story, Fairhope 1894 to 1954, so the first 50 years, Fairhope, the story of a single tax colony. Okay? And I'll talk tonight, especially as you push me, as you may choose, for clarification of what's happened since 1954. Okay? Because you do have the earlier things. And this is a really good book. Being a little compulsive, but always assuring my classes I'm not compulsive. It's sort of like saying I'm not a crook. I'm not compulsive, well, you know he is. But I just happen to have this book outlined, and that is a 2-page front and back, chapter by chapter, but then I have a fuller outline, so every chapter of about 19 chapters is 2 to 3 pages of that, and I'd be happy to share that with any of you. In fact, if you zap me an email, I'd be happy to zap that. I might not have that on email, but I certainly can get a copy of that to you. My email is Gilmore, all lower letter, so Gilmore @shc, Spring Hill College, .edu. Okay, so it's not too complicated an email address. Well, I think it may be best and most chronologically capable of being anticipated if I stay in touch with what you all have. But I don't want to really spend too much time on any particular date or occurrence unless you all would like to bring me back to that one. So in my allotted, I guess I'm back now to about 15 minutes max, let me work through this with you all because it gives you a sense of what was important and what happened and what were they trying to do then, okay? And I have a couple of pages, really just a paragraph or so, isolated from the Blue Book, which I could read very quickly, which would tell you where Fairhope was, for example, in 1906. What did they get done in 12 years? Okay. Well, at any rate, this starts out with the publication of Progress and Poverty, and it may challenge all of you to understand that it actually could happen that a book on economics was a national bestseller. But there had been a downturn in 1876 of major proportions, and it had to do with land speculation. And Henry George, who had grown up in Philadelphia, was a newspaper person in San Francisco, and he could see this leapfrogging event where people would go to where land was the cheapest, buy up as much land as they could get, sit on it, and then when people in the city expanded to that stage, they would buy it up, and they'd buy it, of course, have to buy it at double or triple what was originally paid for it. And that became a whole real estate bubble that burst every bit as significantly as our real estate bubble burst in 2008. Okay? So Henry George and the rationale behind single tax theory and single tax understanding is that somehow land, which they're not making very much more of it. I mean, they say they're not making any more of it, but then they have another part of New York Harbor that all of a sudden is there, and the Netherlands all of a sudden produces more usable land. But by and large, they're not making any more of it. So if people lock it up, okay, the price can become extravagant, and we can have bubbles of various kinds. And Henry George's thought was to harvest that rising value. Okay, and it's to get into single tax very much at all is to get into what I was ranted at in college as HMT, namely a high moral tone where people are passing judgment on you because you are extracting something that you have no right to. So it gets kind of moralistic, judgmental. And it has here in Fairhope with the acquisition by the county and the state and the widening of Highway 181, okay? To put Henry George to what is 121 years later, okay, is the same issue, namely the understanding that it is the community that creates the value of the land. There's a lovely section in Henry George's Progress and Poverty which says, the women and men of this room come, ignoring the rights of the Native Americans, come to some completely unused part of Nebraska, okay? We settle down, or Oklahoma, and we get it free from the United States government. It's worth nothing when we get it, as we get it for nothing, okay? And we, as a community, build a community. Now, a Rockefeller comes through and says, hey, these are hardworking people. I'm going to invest in 50 acres. And he or she gets 50 acres and goes to California, okay? 50 or 100 years later, his or her descendants come back. We have created a community. Fairhope land, adjusted for inflation, all the rest of that, was $6 an acre at the waterfront and $1.25 an acre where we now are. Okay? So the Rockefeller goes out to California. We have built a community. The women and men in this room have obviously built their own improvements and their own lives and their own businesses and all the rest of it. But now the land is worth a lot more, okay? Because the community has created the site value of the land. And the core principle of single tax theory is no individual owns the site value that the whole community has created, okay? And therefore, when people try to extract, and sadly, the earliest colonists of the Fairhope experiment worked on speculation and bonuses. You'll see the word bonus in that book there, which means something under the table, okay, rather than following the strict single tax theory. But at any rate, that's the idea. And the idea, therefore, has this high moral tone that you, the person, the Rockefeller who went to California, has no right to extract a value which he or she did not create. The community created it. And the people who try to extract that value are immorally depriving the community of what the community has created. So it gets a little pushy and a little invasive, you know, morally, because people are passing judgment on other people. So that's now, secondarily, that rising value that is harvested is what runs the community. It's what pays to run the community, to pave the streets, to set up the first waterworks in the whole of Baldwin County, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just by way of introduction to progress and poverty, and maybe we can move a little bit more quickly once you have a sense of that. And please follow up subsequently on questions that you may want to ask about that specifically. So the early ideals in Des Moines were set up very strongly by E.B. Gaston, who is the grandfather of Paul Gaston, recently retired at the University of Virginia, and E.B.'s son, okay, Corny Gaston, and they were the first two secretaries. Okay, there's kind of an astounding record of secretaries, and I didn't realize it until long after we had updated the Constitution in 1999 that we significantly changed the power structure of the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation, because it had 5 directors, and the directors were Superintendent of Health, which you needed perhaps for the first 10 years, if then, Superintendent of Highways, Superintendent of Finances, but they were fragmented individuals beneath a very powerful secretary. So E.B. Gaston was secretary with 1 year out from 1894 until 1936. Okay, he died in 1938. And his son was secretary from 1936 until the early 1970s, say 1972. There was an interim confusion where 3 or 4 people were secretaries without being very dominant, okay, until 1980. And then Gail Rowe became secretary for about 16 years or so. 3 secretaries ran the corporation. And some of you may have known Gail Rowe, who was funny if you happen to think that you were on his side, but he would sit at that table, and if he got really serious opposition from one of those superintendents, he had this shock of white hair, and he was crimson, and everybody backed off. And when we changed the Constitution, we had 5 directors who were functioning as directors and recognizing that they had the authority of the corporation, okay, and the officers executed what the council legislated. So it was intentionally modeled somewhat on the tripartite form of the United States government, where you had an executive branch, a legislative branch, and then the judicial branch would somewhat be paralleled by the trustees, okay? So at any rate, this started out, the initial Constitution was 1894, which you have in the Blue Book. You have various versions of the constitutions, okay? So they set this up. Well, in 1901, the Alabama state constitution outlawed selective site value taxation, which cut off the rationale for the single tax corporation at the knees. As many of you may know, and correct me on this one, that the state of Alabama has the longest constitution of the 50 states, that we are still on that Constitution and we amend things. And when people say, damn Washington, D.C. controlling us and power and stuff like that, not Washington, D.C., it's Montgomery, okay? That keeps us from having local option. Local option meaning we can decide how we want to differentiate taxes that we pay on property as opposed to improvements on property, which of course is what the taxing entities do. At any rate, 1901 therefore was very significant. In 1904, there was a major controversy about raising the rents. A lot of people who did not want a telephone system, did not want the income that the corporation had going towards a telephone system. It changed from, the abbreviations there are the Fairhope Industrial Association. It was not the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation until 1904. So it changed from the Fairhope Industrial Association to the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation. It was incorporated formally in the state of Alabama. In 1907, the organic school developed and was a marvelous attraction. And And this was at a time when Fairhope was literally probably one of the most fascinating and creative and interesting, artsy, politically innovative. Women had the vote from the beginning. You may have seen various things about some of the really colorful people back then, okay? But at any rate, I have underneath that, in a kind of a hyphenated way, the foundation of the roads, the water system, the pier, which rudely was destroyed by various hurricanes, the bay boats, which were rudely destroyed by various fires and other kinds of things, the parks, which we have to this day. So all of that was occurring in that earliest 10 years. By 1908, the women and men who were not members of the Single Tax Corporation said, we really need to have a say in the way this town is run, okay? The perhaps somewhat negative tone would be what all of us perhaps know of a mill town, where the housing and the local store and single tax even paid in scrip initially. So it had a currency control of sorts, all with the most idealistic reasons, but obviously people who were not members and perhaps people who had been turned down for membership could raise a certain amount of resentment. So in 1908, okay, the municipality of Fairhope as an independent town was established. Okay, 1912, the People's Railroad, which never got any further than Midtown, Fairhope. The thought was to extend a railroad from the pier all the way to what is now Highway 59. And therefore there was a spur line of a railroad down Highway 59, and to connect up with that so that goods and manufacturing and farming and fruits and vegetables and what have you could go directly to a railroad. Just didn't work, okay? The utilities went to the city free. If you can imagine being a developer in Fairhope or wherever else, when you buy 10 acres of pecan trees, and you lay out roads, you lay out all the infrastructure, you lay out the lots that people are going to buy and whatever else. When it comes time for the women and men who are part of that development to take over the development, okay, they take over the streets and the infrastructure and the lights and everything else, which you have paid for, okay? The town of Fairhope did not have to pay anything for 28 acres of streets in varying stages of being paved or not being paved, okay? Or for the utilities. To this day, our taxes are what they are in Fairhope because the city of Fairhope owns its own utilities, okay? Now, obviously, it buys electricity from a common supplier and all the rest of that, but that's along with the parks, which we're going to come later. But at any rate, the utilities and streets went. This says 32 acres here. I think the Blue Book says 28, and I better reconcile that somewhere. 1913 may surprise you that that was the passage of the United States Constitution's 16th Amendment, which legitimated an income tax. Income tax had been turned down twice, okay, in the 1800s because of whatever argument you can imagine that may be legitimate to this day. Why charge people more money for working harder? And anything that one could bring to issues about United States taxation, okay? But it cut off at the root the rationale of the Single Tax Corporation to pay all taxes of its members and then by the extraction of that site value be able to pay all those taxes off. Okay? So in 1915, a lawsuit was initiated against the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation that the Single Tax Corporation could not fulfill its most basic rationale for existing. Okay? And it eventually went to the Alabama Supreme Court, and in 1915, it was able to attract free, heavyweight legal advice from all over the United States because single tax theory was still a going concern among the electorate of the United States. Okay? But at any rate, in 1913, that tax was passed, okay? And that is the present rationale, the 16th Amendment of the United States Constitution legitimates the present IRS, which many of us will be consulting in another 8 days. of which God forbid, but not about to. In 1928, and the Blue Book points out that sadly, but with some degree of accuracy, the single tax corporation never operated fully on extracting the site value. It just couldn't, because people came down here and they invested everything they had in building a house and setting up a business and improving their property. So they didn't have the money to pay full site value. So single tax recognized that and never. I can remember when I first moved here, which was 1987, and years shortly thereafter, we had a really first-class person who was an economist teaching the economics class. And correct me quickly right here if you'd like to, but at those times before the bubble and before the bubble burst, land was going up at about 6% a year. Is that figure stick in anybody's mind? Okay. Well, the long and the short of it is the single tax corporation never extracted 6%. And it relied on wharfage fees from the bay boats bringing merchandise over to the present pier, okay, in its former incarnations, as a wooden pier and whatever else, okay? And Joseph Fels, F-E-L-S, as in Fels Avenue, and as in Fels Naphtha, okay, gave thousands of dollars. So the single tax corporation really never justified itself fully by its own rationale, okay? And that really got a kick in the pants in 1928 when the bay boats were no longer the main contact with Mobile, but the causeway was put in and truck traffic, of course, and car traffic could get to Fairhope, okay? In 1929, the stock market crash. By 1931 and 32, and I want to talk truth and not put down the single tax corporation too much, but the donation of the parks was not pure altruism. In a way it was, because the corporation guaranteed that they would be kept for perpetuity to be used as parks, okay, and not for city offices, which was attempted right after World War II, okay, and prevented from happening, okay. But they donated the parks because we couldn't afford to pay the taxes on them. So thereby they were made available, okay? So 31, 32 were when the parks and the pier were given to the city. By 1972, land values really started to rise. In 76, the Bayway came in. The Resner lawsuit, word of mouth says that the lawsuit never would have happened if Corny Gaston, the in-between the three Gastons, had been secretary. But it was just ugly and discriminatory and rude. And namely, you have a problem, get off single tax land. You know, not can we resolve this and work it out or whatever else. And so the Resner lawsuit also went to the Alabama Supreme Court, okay? The clarity of the Resner lawsuit is that the corporation survived every challenge that the Resner initiative posed, but it had used funds that were supposed to be used exclusively for improving the lands and the access to the lands of the membership, and it should not have developed a development somewhere, okay? And so it had to pay the expenses. It had no punitive fines, but it did have to pay the legal expenses of those who initiated the lawsuit, okay? At any rate, that was not really settled for 9 years, as you see, okay? Until when I bought my home, which is on Magnolia Avenue right down the street here, I was allowed to sit in while the owner of the land defended to the executive board that he was only getting the site value back, that I was only paying for this, I was only paying the improvements of the house that was on there. I was not paying him any site value. So I sat in the single tax office, not as a member, okay, a complete outsider, and heard someone say the value of the house has improved, but because I put in marble, I guess it is marble, granite, marble countertops, which I got from a bank or whatever. He had a very insightful and enterprising spouse who had done various things, but he, on the face of it, did not get a cent more than his improvements, what he had paid originally and how he had improved it. So I did not have to pay for the site value of a lot on Magnolia Avenue 2 blocks from here, okay? And that's the way it was because the lease transfer approval had to go through the executive council, and the executive council had to say, yes, this person deserves this number of dollars because he and she have justified it by their investment in the improvements there. And we can see they're not speculating on the site value. By 1992, the Single Tax Corporation saw that that was just not going to work. There were too many ways to get around it. There were problems of items of property that were owned by conglomerates or whatever else, commercial sites and all the rest of that. So they removed that in 1993, and that has existed to the present day. Okay? The one other one that I would want to mention is in 1999, when we updated the Constitution, we initiated those changes, which I didn't realize. I was the chair of the Strategic Planning Committee when we initiated those, and then I was secretary for a while. Okay? And we saw that we really needed to update the Constitution. We just did not need a superintendent of health. Okay? So we recognized that we were going to have 5 directors, and we were going to have a treasurer who was an officer, not one of the 5 directors. So we had to get 75% active support for all of those measures that passed. If people abstained, it counted as a negative vote, because you have to have a 75% active affirmative for an amendment to the Fairhope Single Tax Constitution to pass, okay? And we just didn't realize at the time how that would change the dynamic. And at one stage, the directors, disagreeing with a particular secretary, I might say certainly not me, said, we are the directors of the corporation, and the directors of the corporation get to hire and fire the president and whatever else. You know, the directors of the corporation hire and fire the chief executive officer and the chief operating and all the rest of that. And of course, the people who knew better said, no, 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 no. In the Single Tax Corporation, the membership puts in the officers in various ways. But that's been something of a flow chart challenge ever since 1999. It really didn't come to a flashpoint until early 2001, 2002, or whatever else, when the director said, wait a minute, we're in charge, not the elected leadership. And the elected leadership said, well, we'd like to go to the membership on that, and the membership, of course, supported the Constitution. Well, that's a thumbnail overview. Maybe I have stunned you into silence or whatever, but I'm certainly, if you're anything like, and I see members of the class that I so enjoyed, Mac McCauley and I taught that class last fall in this very building, and I see some of you whom I remember, and you're certainly not shy. It did take a class or two for you to fully show your colors, and then the roar back was great. But Flo, you were part of that class. Corny.
Corny was not his son, was he?
Yes.
His brother.
No, no, son.
He was?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
All right. Okay. I rarely answer a question with one word, but yes, yes.
Prior to the 1908 municipality of public schools, was the organic school the only school available?
I don't know the exact date of the founding of a public school in Fairhope, but it was very early. It was before 1910. Excuse me?
Did it precede the organic school?
Did someone know?
I think Miss.
Donnie?
Yes, public school started in 1898.
Okay, wow, that's early. And of course, even then, there was possibly not a majority of the population of Fairhope who were members of the Single Tax Corporation. It was already, that's an initial insight in terms of the population of the area and how many were members of the Single Tax Corporation and how many were not. And also, if you ever see a map of what are the actual lands owned by the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation and not, it's not contiguous. It's all over the place. Okay, and that marshaled against any kind of organized town.
I have one other question.
Sure.
I forget. Was the motive for your other land, or the Single Tax Corporation, donation of other land, such as the library, Thomas, and whatnot, did it have the same non-altruistic motives of not being able to afford the taxes?
Hard to say, because you're dealing with such an expanse of land. I was just talking to someone who's a good friend, and his home is on Manley Road behind the new high school. okay, for those of us that would say the new high school or whatever, the current high school, okay? At any rate, his home is out there, and we were talking about that whole expanse of softball fields and soccer fields and everything else. The Single Tax Corporation donated that land when it was worth $125,000. And that was not to escape a tax penalty. And that was in 2004, 2002, somewhere not very far back. At any rate, it then was worth $250,000. It abruptly was worth $650 or something like that. The city accepted it as a gift, and that the city would build the soccer complex and that softball complex, which the college team at Spring Hill College has gone to regional playoffs at that complex. Now, many of you may know that both Foley and Gulf Shores are working on huge athletic complexes because it brings in teams and money and all the rest of that. But we did it, and the city did it, out of altruism to the city. And so I would say, short of that major financial challenge that happened between 1928, which of course is the causeway, and then the stock market crash, and then the need to pay taxes, that very probably most of it was really altruistic. The donation of the streets and the utilities was altruistic. Plus, the Single Tax Corporation, people had no business running that stuff. I mean, in the sense of not wanting to be professional politicians. So, yes.
When did Baldwin County start taxing property?
Wow. Anybody, Donnie, do you know that one? When did Baldwin County start taxing property? Very relevant question, because up until the 1913, what 1913? What we pay, the IRS, income taxes. Okay, until the only taxes I think were some property taxes, and that's what your question is, but otherwise they were excise taxes and things like that. You know, you wondered, how did the United States run a country? And I think that would take us back to the Civil War, and how did we pay for the United States Army and the Confederate Army and the rest of that. But there were, in fact, that was part of the bubble that the Single Tax Corporation attempted to take advantage of, that the Single Tax Corporation would exact enough site value from the women and men that were using its land, which was rising in value, to pay their property taxes. So there certainly were property taxes. I have to think when the single tax came here, okay? Yes, because again, that 1901 would be significant, because 1901 prohibited selective taxation on land rather than on land and improvements together. So it may go back to the founding, but then again, the Fairhope single tax community chose Fairhope because of its advantageous tax situation and relatively undeveloped. Yes?
You said that there were 5 superintendents.
Yes?
You listed out 3 of them. The health, highways, and finance. What were the other 2?
Dum 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 dum. Do I get to write that out? And how much do I have to bet on that one? Sorry that. I just happen to have a copy of the old Constitution. Okay? Presidents are a president, vice president, a secretary, a treasurer who shall be superintendent of finance and insurance, 3 trustees, a superintendent each of the following departments: lands and highways, public service, industries, and public health. Okay, and that's Article 5 of the earlier Constitution, which of course is in the Blue Book. Yes?
What was the Rasner lawsuit about?
I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but what I remember was the perception that was accurate, but perhaps overstated, the perception that those outside the city limits were being taxed more than people inside the city limits. And that, you're saying that is correct, and that the leadership of the corporation, both off of the executive council, which is officers and directors, were discriminating against people who are outside the city limits. Okay, and so there were several stages of that lawsuit, and the initial local circuit court reversed a number of practices of the corporation, like who could be a member, could the corporation turn down a lessee who wanted to be a member and not accept him or her as a member. So there was an extended conversation about whether the Fairhope Single Tax Corporation was a corporation or a charitable is primarily a charitable entity, and the different legal obligations to that. And they came out with a marvelous phrase in Latin that the single tax corporation is sui generis, of its own type. Okay, it was absolutely unique, and that's what the Alabama Supreme Court said, because obviously in some ways it is a charitable organization, but it was recognized legally as a commercial organization. Okay. So, other questions, comments, disagreements? Yes?
You talked a bit about Fairhope being an art colony, even early on. So, could you tell us some more about that? How did that happen? Who were the driving forces behind it being an art colony?
There are funny chapters in the Blue Book about simply artsy people coming here. A lot of people coming from Chicago, escaping, snowbirds. Escaping the winter up there and coming down, and various authors coming here, and that it being advertised as a creative experience. So, pardon? I was going to say Marietta Johnson, who was brought here by a former president, Lydia Cummings, who was president of the Single Tax Corporation and knew of her, and that she was very interested in progressive education. And some of you may know that no less than John Dewey, okay, who is probably one of the most outstanding American philosophers in the history of Western philosophy in a lot of ways, came here, and his son went to the organic school for a semester or so. And in John Dewey's book, Schools of Tomorrow, the picture at the beginning of the book is what you see down there on the bluff with Marietta Johnson sitting surrounded by a group of students, except it's a larger number in the photograph. Okay? So the fact that John Dewey was here, the fact that that Marietta Johnson not only ran the organic school here, which was incredibly successful approximately until her decline and her death, she started another Fairhope Organic School in Greenwich, Connecticut. Can you spell upscale suburb? Okay? And had it going for a while. She knew the president, Woodrow Wilson. I think she knew Woodrow Wilson's wife personally, did fundraising for the schools in various ways. So there was a pretty wide expanse. So I never can remember, somebody correct me on this one, whether it was Upton Sinclair or Sinclair Lewis. I think it was Upton Sinclair. Is that who wrote one of his novels here? And it just got a reputation of an experimental place. That because of its innovative political and cultural experience, there were very early women's movement groups that came here, a group that eventually founded a colony in Nicaragua, I think. You'll even see something about nude bathing, okay? Or people with open robes just sloshing them, say, down to the bay and stuff like that, and all the little boys, tee-heeing behind the trees and stuff like that. I think some of this is in Mary, the butterfly tree? Excuse me? Yeah, Mary Lois Timms, but now Mary Lois, last name? Yes, Mary Lois Adshead. And there are a number of books that are things like that. And I might do a plug. Allison, what's your book title? A Salubrious Climate. And that Allison's great-grandfather was one of the two greats, okay, was one of the team that visited places in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Alabama to choose the particular site that they would get. And that great-grandfather has a street named for him in the Colony Acres over there by the ball fields. Okay. Yes, Knight.
Something that's not
Knight's question, for those of you that asked me to speak more loudly, is when did correct me if this, when did the single tax corporation become a 501c4? Is that your question? Okay, a 501c3, most of you know, is a charitable organization that you can donate to and then deduct from your taxes and things like that. A 501c4 has gotten much more aggressive searching out by the IRS since we were able to initiate it. We initiated it probably in 2001, 2002, but in the final or second from final year that I was president, and I stepped down as president in 2004, okay? So probably 2003, in there somewhere, we had solicited relief from paying $150,000 a year. Okay, so women and men like yourselves were paying their fees and what have you to the single tax corporation, and we had to turn around and send $150,000 of it to Washington, D.C. instead of investing it in Fairhope. Okay, pardon?
It was income tax.
It was income tax because they perceived that somewhere along the line the pie was going to get divided up and distributed, and therefore they ought to get their piece of the pie early along. So we were turned down 2 or 3 times. 4 of us went in person to the IRS in 2003 or thereabouts. And it was really kind of funny because the bureaucrats who had turned us down sort of edged and, you know, were kind of timid in the room. And the reason that they were timid in the room is the powerhouse of their their superintendent was in the room. Okay, which I think I can say without fear of being accused of being politically incorrect. My experience of going to Fordham University in the scenic Bronx and being around ethnic groups was a Jewish mama. And it was real clear that she was who everybody was deferring to. And somehow we were able to make a contact with her, and she, after about 45 minutes of do this and we can do that and do the other thing, she stood up and she said, "Enough. Resubmit. Use the phrase, you are relieving the burdens of government, and you'll get it." And we did, and we got it, okay? And they said, in the midst of that, they said we had all the things that we did, all the different things, the paving, the parks, the donations of this, that, and the other thing. And we got really good letters from Eddie Boyette, who was head of recreation at the time, from the mayor, from all sorts of people, okay? But she pointed out, one of the things you do that you have not emphasized is you guarantee the revenue commissioner the full amount of the taxes on all lands to which the single tax corporation holds title. They get it free and clear. If somebody owes, you pay it, and then we, the single tax corporation, go after the follow-up on that. And she said that is a substantial alleviating the burdens of government, that you do that. And it might have been you that pointed out, no, I think it was Oliver Gilmore, who pointed out that the single tax, well, actually, he asked a question to which Mac Macaulay was able to point out that if your land, if you are on a single tax lot, the single tax corporation pursues very accurately whether your land is properly assessed, whether the taxes on it, which the single tax corporation, of course, pays, and then you make good to the single tax corporation, okay, is correct. And some bureaucrat didn't hit the wrong key somewhere, or something was just improperly assessed or whatever else, so that the single tax corporation bird dogs every single parcel, which obviously is an advantage to the individual person, that's all being done effectively free of charge, okay? So at any rate, that's another aspect of the 501c4, and that's surely more than you asked. I think you asked for a simple date, and
The reason it occurred to me is that you were talking about Resner and how they distinguished between, they asked, what is it? Is it a corporation? Is it a charity?
yes,
But the 501c4 was created since Resner.
yes,
In a sense, things have changed.
oh yeah,
Since Resner.
right,
Because of that.
yes. Among other things, the corporation does not have to send $150,000 to Washington, D.C., and most recently gave a cool $1 million to Thomas Hospital. You know, you don't know whether to say, oh, why don't you just lower our fees or our rents, instead of that? But look what Fairhope is and continues to be, and not only continues to be, but continues to expand the quality of life that it has, and to some extent, some of you might say, is this nanny government extended yet further? Or is this, to go back to the high moral tone, the single taxes perception, organizations and memberships perception, okay, that this is returning to the community what the community has created, okay? So, but other people might have questions, which I certainly can repeat. Yeah, Donnie. And then
one more time that while the Alabama Constitution outlaws site values.
No, it doesn't outlaw it. It outlaws how you can apportion it. Okay? Excuse me. It reserves to itself. The legislature of the state of Alabama reserves to itself how tax policy will be implemented. And correct me on this, because I, of course, may be wrong, but it is dependent upon acts of the legislature or on amendments to the Constitution. In other words, we don't have local option where we could say, fine, we will get you X amount of dollars that you want from us. But let us decide how that is apportioned.
That means you can't assess the property?
You can, but you don't trump the state and county authorities. You can do whatever you want, but they want not only the bucks, but they want to control how the bucks are extracted. So it's a power thing, and a political thing and all the rest of that. Which one could say, I mean, whether we're ideological Democrats or ideological Republicans or whatever, it seems to me both of those communities would want local option, that we can decide how we do this. And if we want commercial, we want to encourage business in certain areas and give them bigger tax breaks or do various other things. Should that not be within the rights of the women and men who live in a particular area? No. Pardon?
For example, George, we pay off the top of all taxes, 10 mills goes to the Alabama School Board, and that is supposedly to go to less economically affluent counties. That 10 mills is off the top of what we make. And that's one of the things that, as a citizen, I would like of Baldwin County, because basically this is a wealthy county because of Fairhope and because of Gulf Shores, and we pay a lot of money into the structure for the Alabama school system.
The state as a whole.
And we don't get it because we're affluent, so we don't get a lot of federal money. Where other counties get our 10 mills that we've extracted. So that's something that needs to be changed.
Well, that of course speaks to taxation in the United States generally, and taking from those who have apparently and giving it to those who don't, and all of the moral and legal implications behind that. Yes, you wanted to ask.
I never heard of a 501c4 before. Is that sort of like a 501c3 but applied to an organization or an entity?
Yes, and I think, apropos of Knight's question, that it is not just charitable, because that's a 501c3. Okay, a nonprofit, charitable organization, et cetera, which includes a lot, colleges, hospitals, all sorts of things, okay? But a 501c4 is specifically connected to responding to the needs of the municipality as a whole. So it has a very direct civic motivation, as opposed to a generic charitable availability, okay? And I think while I would want to answer you as fully as possible, one knows that CPAs and tax lawyers and all the rest of them earn substantial salaries responding to the implications of that question. So, yes?
So it is not regarded in any manner as charity?
Hard to say, because
It's my understanding that it is,
that it is or was. Well, yes. Except that the Resner suit has not been overturned in what it said. namely, and it didn't say that much, really. It basically said that the single tax corporation had a right to establish its own categories for membership, exclusion and inclusion and various other things, and its right to title to its own land, which of course has been challenged in a variety of ways. But what it said has not been reversed in terms of defining and accepting the single tax corporation's understanding of itself as a commercial organization. And maybe that's where the 501c4 comes in also, because if it were charitable, it would have qualified as a 501c3 a long time ago. And Harold, you informed me of something I didn't know about, that somebody has, I don't know who has the right to do this, I don't know that the corporation did it, but there is a 501c3 set up in the name of the corporation or something like that? Colony Trust. That might be what handles the finances of the cemetery? Pardon? No? Excuse me? It's in addition to that. A third entity. So, excuse me?
It was Mac McCauley could tell you more about that, but there is a trust.
Elodie, yes.
It was set up, there was a lady that
Oh.
wanted to donate her land
Ah,
to the colony.
yes.
And she was unable to donate because of the 501c4 status, so that foundation was set up in order for her to be able to.
So that she could donate it to a 501c3 and thereby get the tax benefits to herself because of that. Okay, so that may clarify also the differences. And the fact that the Resner suit did not reverse the understanding of the corporation as a commercial organization and thereby deserving status as a 501c4, because as a commercial organization, it could relieve the burdens of government, which was a specific focus, rather than generic charitable donations.
So would it become a 501c4 in response to the resident?
No, no. It was because we had a secretary named Charles Ham, and the two of us served together, so we got to know each other pretty well. And he saw this as, why don't we do this? I mean, he's a lawyer. Charles Ham was and is a lawyer, and he said, why don't we do this? And we had at that time a particular law firm out of Birmingham that said, sure, you can do it. I don't know what it cost us, but we certainly got it back within less than 2 years of not having to send $150,000 to Washington. But no, it was not a response to any lawsuit at all, as far as I know. Now, some canny mind among our legal counsel may have said, hey, this will protect you against future lawsuits, which some of you may know, that a living trust or something like that makes it harder to be sued, etc. Well, it's getting up towards 7. Does anybody have a final question or two, or would you like to flee? Looks like everybody would like to flee, so thank you. All right, thanks very much.